My best wishes to all of you for the civil services preparations. So as the title indicates, what I will do today is to sort of examine what has determined India's South Asia policy since independence. I think it's important to understand India's South Asia policy, India's neighborhood policy better, because in my opinion, the rise of India as a major power, or the lack thereof as a major power, is dependent to a great extent and will be determined by its relationship with the neighborhood. So the neighborhood in many ways is going to determine what kind of power India is going to become. And therefore, it is important for us to understand some of the underlying drivers, the determinants of India's South Asia policy, as it were. History tells you that India has had a troubled relationship with its immediate neighborhood in the South Asian region, despite being the region's biggest power that India is in every sense of the term, territorially, materially, wealth-wise. So I would say, geopolitically speaking, several things have impacted the region in a variety of ways. For a long time, the geopolitics in the South Asian region was a function of the legacy of the British Raj. And I'm coming to that in a second in more detail. The post-partition, India-Pakistan partition, conflicts also shaped the region in significant ways. The Cold War also had an impact on the South Asian region, though not in very acute ways. In fact, the non-alignment helped India fend off the pressure of the Cold War from the region. I mean, in most other parts of the world, Cold War did have a role to play. But in the South Asian region, the role was limited simply because India was not the major power in the region. India was not with either of the two superpowers and had decided to pursue its own policy, as it were, which is the non-aligned policy in many ways. Finally, the rise of China, I would say, is the single most significant factor that will shape the South Asian region. So in the past, India had used both soft power and hard power to influence the politics of the region. But I think its ability to do so, to influence the region through hard power and soft power, is limited because of the Chinese presence, or the rise of China, and the arrival of China on the scene in South Asia. A lot of people make the argument that domestic politics does not shape foreign policy to a great extent. But in the Indian case, if you actually take a look at India's regional policy or neighborhood policy, you will see that domestic political calculations and considerations have indeed shaped India's South Asia policy. And this is becoming more pronounced in the contemporary times under Mr. Modi and the BJP government, as it were. But I want to sort of, in this lecture, stick to 5 drivers of India's regional policy. The region is determined in particular ways, shaped in particular ways because of the presence of certain variables. But what I'm going to focus on in this lecture, for the most part of this lecture, is sort of trying to understand what are those 5 drivers of India's regional policy, as it were. Now, number one, I think, shaper or driver of India's regional policy is the remnants of the British colonial legacy. Right? India is in many ways, quote unquote, the legatee state or the successor state of the British Raj in the subcontinent. So the remnants of that legacy continued to, in many ways, or for a long time, continued to shape India's regional policy. The second driver, I would say, is India's great power aspirations. Now, you may say it is a great power, you may say leading power, major power, call it what you want. I don't want to get into a terminological hair splitting of that. But frankly, the great power aspirations that India has harbored has also shaped India's regional policy in some ways. Thirdly, India's sense of insecurity about the region. Now, that may come as ironical to you because India is the most powerful country in the region. Well, I'm not talking about China, of course, but the other states in the South Asian region. India is in any case, China is not a member of South Asia as it is traditionally conceived of. So India's sense of insecurity about the region is also a driver of India's regional policy. Number four, India's worries about China traditionally and China's ascendance today continue to shape India's regional policy. So India's concerns about China, its intentions, its capability, its rise, its ascendance, all of this now tend to shape India's South Asia policy. Finally, India's mixed record on regionalism, or may I say half-hearted desire for regionalism, has also shaped India's South Asia policy. Now let's go one by one. Let's take the example, let's take the case of the first driver, which is the British colonial legacy. One of the, and I continue to argue that one of the primary drivers of India's regional policy towards South Asia is the British colonial legacy. The Indian subcontinent became South Asia in the way that it is today when the colonial rulers divided up the British India to create independent India and Pakistan in 1947. And of course, when East Pakistan became Bangladesh in 1971. So in that sense, the coinage or the term South Asia is of recent vintage, notwithstanding its historical and civilizational linkages as a geographical and civilizational entity. So South Asia may have had its civilizational and geographical sort of linkages, and yet the term South Asia is of recent coinage, probably 1970s, 1980s sort of coinage. Now let's take a very brief look at the inherited legacy of the British colonial rule in India. Independent India, if you actually read history, you will realize that independent India inherited the British imperial legacy as well as a colonial bureaucratic mindset vis-a-vis the South Asian region. Although without the British Empire's material and military wherewithal to deal with the region. So the British left, but they left behind a colonial bureaucratic mindset, which continued at least for some time, right? The South Asia that India inherited in 1947 was a colonial construct, which made it a far complicated one for a newly decolonized weak state such as India to manage. In fact, if you look at history, you will see that immediately after independence, there were two divergent visions for post-independent, the role of post-independent India in Asia. The one view was that of K.M. Panikkar, something that Vallabhbhai Patel agreed to, and the other view being that of Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, Vallabhbhai Patel and Panikkar wanted India to have a more preeminent security role for India in the Asian region, whereas Nehru realized that was not possible. India is a weak state; it's a poor state. It didn't have the material and military wherewithal of the British Empire, so we simply could not sustain the security presence that the British Empire had around the Asian region. But there was this divergent vision. In fact, if you take a look at the new book published by the former National Security Advisor Shankar, India and the Asian geopolitics, you will see some discussion about that in that book. So although Nehru chose not to continue the British security policies in the Asian region, for political continuity and national security purposes, the Congress government led by Nehru in Delhi chose to continue many of the colonial arrangements in the region, with the neighborhood, with the South Asian countries, right? So here was a civilizational entity becoming a compact modern state in 1947, modeled after the Westphalian archetype, right? You know, the Westphalian Treaty and all of that, through an act of partition and forced to live with the pre-existing colonial arrangements. That is the story of the independent independent India's relationship with South Asia, I would say. So the British colonial legacy meant several things to an independent India and its relationship with the South Asian region. Point number one, and we are still in the first driver, by the way, if you're losing track at some level. So the creation of a buffer around it, and I'm sure you have read about this in during your preparations. The colonial practice of creating buffer states around the Indian Empire was one of the cornerstones of the British grand strategy to defend its most prized possession, which is the British India, right? So it created protectorates and formed special arrangements and relationship with the states outside the boundary of the empire. So it had two. The buffer arrangement had two rings. One is the outer ring and the inner ring. I don't get into the details thereof, but the geopolitical and territorial norms. So when the British built this buffer state system in the region, it had its norms and rules and traditions, etc., etc. So the geopolitical and territorial norms that the colonial rulers, the British colonial rulers, had put in place also survived them. So you have a new government now, an independent Indian government led by the Congress party, but some of these norms are simply not going to be washed away or wished away immediately. It survived the British, as it were. To quote a very famous American author on South Asia, Stephen Cohen, and I quote, the British had bequeathed a number of important geopolitical norms. These included the need for buffers to the north, sea denial in and around the Indian peninsula, and the protection of an inner ring of defense, with a periphery that included the smaller states around India. So that is what the British had created, and the British left that for India. It was for India to decide how much of that India wanted to inherit. And as I said, India did inherit some of that. So when the British handed over India to the Indians in 1947, they not only handed over a chunk of territory, but a set of norms, traditions, and a worldview and a strategic culture and a strategic view about South Asia. The political bosses in Delhi changed, but the bureaucracy, especially the Indian political service and how it viewed the region, did not really change much. Nor did the political class bring about fundamental changes in the pre-existing geopolitical arrangements with its neighborhood. So the politicians changed, or the rulers changed, but the bureaucracy did not change. The strategic culture did not change. And the political class did not really bring about any fundamental changes in the sort of strategic culture of the country in some ways. This kind of a continuation was convenient for everybody involved. The political class that was busy with poverty, post-partition violence, making sure that the state is constructed in a proper manner. So politicians were busy with that. The very few civil servants that we had were also busy with, making sure that everything sort of stayed in one piece, etc. So some of the buffer zone policies continue to exist even till date, even though in a more subtle manner. And I want to read out a small quote from Sunil Khilnani, an Indian origin author based in the United States. He says that India's claim to what China considers undemarcated territories and its desire to create buffer zones, for example, through compliant governments in Nepal and Bhutan, its pursuit of hegemony within the South Asian region, and its efforts to control maritime access through the Indian Ocean are all viewed as persistent emanations of British India's external policy. So don't think that just because British left, they took all their policies with them, but the policy stayed back. So what was the impact of this buffer mindset? One direct impact of this buffer mindset that the British left behind and Indians inherited was keeping the independent India's borders closed to most neighbors to ensure the security of the hinterland India. Now, former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, talks about that in some very interesting ways. He says, India's traditional mindset of viewing borders as walls of protection from the adversaries continued continues to be persistent. New Delhi, according to Shamsaran, is not in a habit to see its borders as connectors, a transmission belt on which developmental impulses can travel without barriers. So the result of this buffer mindset in some ways was the practice of keeping the border regions underdeveloped, especially in the northeast of India. So the fear that the Chinese, if we built roads and infrastructure in the northeast of India, the Chinese would sort of roll into hinterland India using those very borders, actually prevailed in the Indian sort of strategic mindset for a very long time. Right now, the Look East and Rechristened as Act East policy, as part of that, India has now started opening up to the Southeast Asian region, and as a result of that, India is building now more border infrastructure, etc., etc. Which is also why the Chinese are very upset about it in some ways, in a very ironic sense of the term, because India had initially thought that if you built infrastructure, Chinese would sort of rush in. Now India's that did not happen for the most part, but now India is building infrastructure and moving military there, and that has hurt the Chinese to some extent, right? The another impact of the buffer mindset was the intolerance of foreign intervention in the South Asian region, be it in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, or in Nepal, or in Bangladesh. British India was keen to ensure that the immediate and extended neighborhood was kept free of foreign presence or influence. And the post-independent Indian state continued to ensure that outside powers did not really gain a foothold in the region. Right. So one of the objectives of its non-alignment policy in many ways was to ensure that the Cold War bloc rivalry, which played out in other parts of the world, did not play out in the neighborhood. So through its non-alignment policy, India ensured that that bloc rivalry did not play out. If you actually look at it this way, the barring Pakistan, much of the subcontinent was not really a chessboard for the Cold War great games to play out. Pakistan became, of course, part of the CETO and CENTO and all of that. So New Delhi's insistence on non-alignment was partly responsible for this state of affairs in some ways, which of course subtly changes in 1971 when India and Soviet Union signs a treaty of friendship and all of that, right? Another implication of the colonial sort of legacy is that India sees itself as the center of the region in many ways, the center of the political activity and sort of geopolitical activity in the region, right? Because the British India viewed itself as the center of the South Asian region in many ways. So given that the colonial government headquartered in Calcutta, later shifted to New Delhi, of course, had much of the region directly under its control, or had special relationship with others such as the buffer states, the decisions made in the Indian capital was crucial for the entire region. Right, I mean, now the region, of course, got divided up and into smaller parts, etc., etc. But when the British were in the subcontinent, the rules and the norms and the policies that were made in Calcutta and later in Delhi had English for the entire region, right? So during those years, New Delhi was the fulcrum of regional geopolitics, the center of regional geopolitics. Post-independence, after independence, India saw itself for the most part as the successor state of the British India. Pakistan was much smaller economically, militarily, geographically, and population-wise, right? There's a famous author, Sneha Mahajan. She argues that the view of India being a legatee or a legacy successor state of Imperial Britain's role in South Asia was strong within independent India's foreign policy establishment. So the foreign policy establishment that came to be after the British left had a very strong feeling that we are the legatee of the Imperial Britain's role in the South Asian region. So independent India, according to Sneh Mahajan, followed Britain's established practices of dealing with the South Asian countries. To give you an example, India and Pakistan inherited obligations under as many as 627 treaties, agreements, and conventions signed by the British and with other countries. India also inherited the foreign policy establishment from the British. The Indian Political Service, the IPS, was dissolved and the Indian Foreign Service was created, but independence India's bureaucracy continued to function on the basis of the previously established practices, precedents, treaties, and diplomacy. Also, what is important to note here is that the foreign policy establishment or the British government in Calcutta and later Delhi had, and its officers had, a great deal of functional autonomy and policy autonomy from the Whitehall in London. So London had given a lot of autonomy to the officials and bureaucracies in Calcutta and in Delhi, right? So what happens when you have a new government in Delhi? It also tends to inhere that autonomy, that we have managed things so far, now we'll continue to manage. That we have a certain responsibility towards the region, we have a certain sway in the region, etc. Sunil Khilani argues, for instance, though a creation of British imperial interests, the British Raj created its own regional foreign policy, distinct from and sometimes in tension with the British foreign policy emanating from London. This meant that the post-independent foreign policy bureaucracy in New Delhi did not inhere a tabula rasa or a clean slate in dealing with the region. It hit the new government, the new establishment in New Delhi, 1947, hit the ground running based on what it had been doing until August 14, 1947. Then for the colonial state, and now for the independent Indian state. Not too much of a difference, right? Now the second, that I think is the first driver. It is important to understand that colonial history and many of the legacies of that colonial history was passed on to the Indian independent bureaucracy and strategic culture. It is important to understand that if we have to understand the evolution of India's South Asia policy, India's regional policy. That is the first driver of India's regional policy. The second driver of India's regional policy really is great power aspirations of India, right? One of the key drivers of India's regional policy is its desire to become a great power or a major power or a leading power. These are variously used by various people, and be accepted as accepted as a major power or a great power by the international system and the regional subsystem in the South Asian region. So India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was keen to carve out a distinct role for India in the Committee of Nations, while at the same time avoiding the trap of the Cold War rivalry. But there were not too many takers for India's great power status or claims to great power status outside of India. India was still a poor country, not very powerful, etc., etc. But there seems to be a lot more articulation today. Its leaders are a lot more articulate about India's role in the world, India as a system shaper, India as a major power, etc. In 2015, for example, Prime Minister Modi said during a meeting with India's heads of missions abroad, he urged them to use this unique opportunity to help India position itself in a leading role rather than just a balancing force globally, right? New Delhi's newfound resoluteness in dealing with Pakistan and China are perhaps an indicative of the desire for India to carve out a new identity for itself as a more confident power and as a rising major power. Scholar Ian Hall talks about the coinage of Subramaniam Shankar. then Foreign Secretary and now the Foreign Minister of India, India as a leading power. So India, Jaishankar kept talking in 2015 as India as a leading power and not as a balancing power. So there's a lot more desire in India about the need to become a great power in the international system. The United States has consistently supported this this desire by India. In fact, oftentimes the Americans have urged India to call on India to take special responsibilities in the region and in the international system, including to checkmate China's encirclement of the region, etc. In fact, India's naval capabilities have been particularly attractive to the Western powers in the region because Chinese Navy is now becoming a blue water navy, and it is sort of challenging the former status quo in the larger Indian Ocean region, and that also perhaps explains why there is this new coinage from Asia Pacific to India Pacific, giving India a certain role in the region, as it were. Right. So New Delhi, if you look at India's involvement in the region, you will also see India has carried out disaster relief operations in the region with great aplomb and great praise by the people in the region and elsewhere. During the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, New Delhi helped out countries such as Sri Lanka, Maldives, Indonesia, etc. In 2017, during the cyclone, India had Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. In 2015, the Indian Air Force rescued not only its own citizens from Yemen, but also the citizens from over 40 countries or so. So the recent debate about or talk about the quadrilateral alliance, as it were, and in the Indo-Pacific has further strengthened India's role in the region, especially in the maritime sphere. Now, the question really is whether India would be able to stand up to the Chinese in the region and sort of articulate and assert India's role in the region. I'm coming to the China bit in a while, but at least India has had this feeling about itself that India is a great power in the region, and that has driven India's policies towards the region. Of course, there are doubts about whether or not India is going to be a great power. The Economist magazine, for example, a very well-respected British magazine, The Economist, wrote in 2013. That was 8 years ago, before the pandemic hit us the second time over. India is often spoken of in the same breath as China because of its billion-plus population, economic promise, value as a trading partner, and growing military capabilities. All 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council support India's claim to join them, some of them grudgingly though. But whereas China's rise is a given, India is still widely seen as a nearly power, quote unquote, nearly power that cannot quite get its act together. People like Ashley Tell is a very key thinker based out of Washington, D.C., an Indian-born thinker in Washington, D.C., wrote in 2016 that while India may play a genuine role in the international system, by 2050, it may remain a swing state rather than a power capable of either holding its own against a major rival such as China or working the international system to its advantage. Even by 2015, we are not looking at India becoming a major international power, as it were. So while India wants to be a major power, while it does this desire to become a major power influence India's policies towards the region, there are question marks about whether or not India will be able to become a major power, right? So one of the reasons I think why India's growth as a major power is hindered is because of the politics in the region, because of the geopolitics in the region. Look at it this way. India is right at the center of a very volatile region, a region rife with religious, terrorist, political, and domestic violence. States in the region almost all of whom with whom India has borders, have unsettled borders, territorial claims, and some have nuclear weapons. So argument didn't come out quite well. India has difficulties with a lot of countries in the region, some of with whom we have unsettled borders, some of who have territorial claims in India, like Pakistan, and some have nuclear weapons, like China and Pakistan. So India is in the middle of all of this. So it becomes impossible for India not to get involved or get caught in some of those difficulties, some of those conflicts, some of that violence. Once it gets involved in such conflicts, it becomes difficult for India to pacify them. The ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka is a great example. India did involve in the late 1980s in Sri Lanka, and it got caught in the middle of that, and we lost a prime minister because of our entanglement in Sri Lanka. So some analysts have argued that the more India is embroiled, entangled in regional conflicts, the more China would be able to rise globally and expand in the region unhindered. So in other words, China would like to see India is entangled in regional conflicts, so that India is boxed in the region, so that it can continue to rise and be a superpower and do what it wants in the region. So China likes to keep India boxed in South Asia and its various conflicts, so that India's attention is diverted while China pursues its global agenda, as it were. So unlike India, for a very long time, China tended to keep a distance when it came to internal conflicts in the neighboring countries. India was involved in many ways in the politics in the region. India was interfering in the politics of the region, be it Nepal, be it Myanmar, be it Sri Lanka. If you look at China, until recently, China was simply not involved in it at all. Right? So India was trying to pacify the region. That is one interpretation of it, because India thinks that unless you pacify the region, you would not be able to rise as a great power. Because the argument is that if you don't pacify the region, you will not be able to rise as a major power. Raja Mohan, I'm sure you've read Raja Mohan a lot. Raja Mohan has argued that without enduring primacy in one's own neighborhood, no nation can become a credible power on the global stage. Right. Both Raja Mohan and Professor S.D. Muni have argued that India's ability to manage its neighborhood will go on to determine its objective of becoming a key Asian power. So India realizes, on the one hand, that unless and until India is involved in the region and pacifies the region and puts its stamp on the region, it cannot be able to rise as a major power in the international system. And at the same time, because India gets involved in the region, and like China, it gets embroiled in that, and it gets distracted by that, and gets boxed in by that. And because of that, India is not able to rise as a power in the region or in the world stage. So that's quite a paradoxical situation, as it were. This desire for great power status in the region has also, to some extent, tended to make India follow what is called a Monroe Doctrine. I mean, that the Americans had in South America, for example, right? So thanks to its legacy of the Raj, the British Raj, and its great power aspirations, New Delhi has also been reluctant about accepting external interference in the neighborhood. I spoke about that earlier. In the past, India has, on the other hand, militarily intervened. India does not allow others to intervene in its neighborhood, but it does intervene in its neighborhood, right? Because India sees itself as a preeminent power in the region because of various factors that I explained earlier. So in the past, India has militarily intervened in the then East Pakistan to defeat Pakistan and to help the creation of Bangladesh. It led a failed military campaign to Sri Lanka in the 1980s. It carried out Operation in Maldives in 1988 at the request of the then Maldivian president, of course. Um, it has also intervened in Sri Lanka and in Nepal in the recent past, politically and diplomatically, but not to the liking of these two countries. So India is opposed to others intervening, as I said, but India clearly intervenes as and when it thinks that its interests are at stake. Now, this policy is meeting with some challenges from the neighborhood. There is a pushback. Two reasons. And what are these two reasons? Unlike earlier in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, when India did intervene in the region, the resistance from the region was weaker or meek, right, towards Indian interference. One. Today, that pushback has increased. The region is pushing back. Be it Sri Lanka, be it Nepal, they are pushing back. So India's ability to intervene has come down. Secondly, the rise of China and its ability to checkmate India's regional policies have made it difficult for New Delhi to intervene in the affairs of its neighbors. So when India is seen as interfering, for example, in Nepal. What does Nepal do? Nepal runs to China, saying that, hey, here is this guy interfering in our domestic affairs. Do something about it. And then China sort of provides a certain amount of protection to Nepal. It becomes difficult for India to do what it did previously. Right? So the desire to become a great power has also prompted India to become a regional security provider for the region, as it were. New Delhi has tried to play the role of a regional security provider in South Asia, though it is a recent phenomenon in many ways. India has a special defense partnership with the Indian Ocean states, such as Mauritius, and has a mutual defense partnership with Bhutan, which, as you know, was invoked by India when the 2017 Doklam crisis unfolded between India and China. Doklam, as you know, is a part of the Bhutanese territory. It's a tri-junction, as it were, right? Over the years, New Delhi seems to have taken this a role of a security provider more seriously, at least at the declaratory level, with the active encouragement by the Western countries, particularly the United States. Over the years, you would see more decision makers in New Delhi have been using the phrase net security provider than ever before. Prime Minister Monroe Singh, for example, asserted, the then Prime Minister asserted that India has sought to assume our responsibility for stability in the Indian Ocean region. We are well positioned, therefore, to become a net provider of security in our immediate neighborhood and beyond. Having said that, so all of this goes to show that India has been trying to engage the region in a way that puts India's stamp of preeminence on the region, because India wants to rise as a major power. And yet, there seems to be a certain amount of lack of clarity about how India wants to deal with the South Asian region and the larger neighborhood. There seems to be an unmistakable sense of reluctance in India's regional policy. There is a lack of clarity on how India wants to deal with South Asia. It simply hasn't made up its mind, nor does it have serious material, political, and military wherewithal to be the region's great power. It is a regional giant economically, geographically, and population-wise. But that is not good enough to become the indisputable regional power, as it were. For example, India has been and continues to be deeply reluctant about force projection in external armed conflicts. Consider this. Despite explicit requests from the United States, the Indian side continues to be unwilling to send troops, to first Iraq and then to Afghanistan. Even the BJP government, the then BJP government of Vajpayee, the now BJP government of Mr. Modi, have both not agreed to sending troops outside. So if India wants to see itself, I'm not saying India should send troops, I'm simply saying if India wants to project itself as a major power, then can it do so without taking certain responsibilities? And responsibilities may sometimes involve sending material and military help, at least according to certain interpretation. Now, it's up to you to decide whether that is a right thing or not, but the question is very simple. Can you be a great power without assuming the roles that come with that great power status? Let me now come to the third driver of India's South Asia policy or regional policy. The first one was the colonial legacy. The second one was India's desire to become a great power. How these two have shaped India's regional policy, I just examined. Now we will come to how a sense of deep insecurity in India have been a driver of India's South Asia policy. The insecurity that the country has felt in the past or currently feels vis-a-vis the region or towards the international system has gone on to shape India's regional policy. Even though India is the biggest power in the region, barring China, of course, it continues to face and battle several insecurities. Let's go one by one. The China threat, perhaps, is India's biggest worry today. The 1962 war with China and the humiliating defeat that we faced at the hands of the Chinese have left an unforgettable mark on the Indian psyche. There is indeed a perceptible difference in how New Delhi approached national security after the 1962 debacle. A lot, if you read the Indian diplomatic history, foreign policy history, you would see that much of India's idealist and activist thinking underwent a sharp change after the 1962 military defeat at the hands of the Chinese, where India found itself almost friendless in many ways. Although, soon after that, the Americans and others started giving India weapons, etc. So this insecurity after 1962 was visible in many ways. If you sort of try and analyze it. After 1962, for example, India spent more money on defense preparedness and was unwilling to talk about a plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir with Pakistan. Until 62, India was, open about it, talking about it, etc. But 62 changed all of that. Eventually, India abrogated its special status that was given to Sikkim. It started rethinking its nuclear options after 1964 or so, and began talking to the United States about the possibility of a nuclear umbrella for itself. You might be very surprised to hear that in the late 1960s, after the Lopnor nuclear test undertaken by the Chinese, India approached both the United Kingdom and the United States for nuclear umbrella. Both of them said no. And then you have the 1974 test. Of course, it took a very long time for India after 1974 to develop nuclear weapons. India developed nuclear weapons by about late 1980s, officially tested and declared in 1998, as you know. So what I'm trying to say is that the 1962 debacle at the hands of the Chinese had a major impact on the Indian psyche as far as national security was concerned. India became insecure, and that showed in its actions. India's approach to South Asian region and China's role in it is today shaped by that insecurity India feels vis-a-vis China. Right? There are also other sources of insecurity. The state of India-Pakistan relations, for instance, and the general sense of insecurity that India feels vis-a-vis Pakistan also drives India's regional policy. The India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir and the terror emanating from Pakistan, both with implications in Jammu and Kashmir and in mainland India, has not only conditioned India's approach to the second biggest state in the region, which is Pakistan, but but also towards SAARC for that matter. So the threat that India feels from Pakistan has not only shaped India's Pakistan policy, It has also shaped India's policy towards the South Asian region through the instrument of SARC. SARC is not a functioning platform. Why is that? Because of the India-Pakistan fight on the various SARC platforms, as it were. In the past, for instance, India's relations with Nepal and Bangladesh were also affected by the Pakistani terror angle, given how both these countries had often aided and abetted and were used as conduits by Pakistani agencies to infiltrate terror into India, right? India's relations with Sri Lanka was shaped by the terror perpetrated by the LTTE in the 1980s and 1990s, given how a foreign by India's former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was killed by the LTTE. The link between Pakistan-sponsored terrorism or Pakistani terror outfits and domestic insurgencies in India is also a concern for India, and it's well documented how Pakistan has managed to sponsor, say, for example, Sikh militancy in the 1980s, which caused the life of Indira Gandhi, for instance, or how China and Pakistan continue to sponsor insurgencies in the Northeast, especially in Manipur and Nagaland. And these have all been worries that India faced about the neighborhood. So it is not as if India has been, reading the right act to the South Asian countries. Often they have been the sources of insecurity for India. India also has unsettled borders with some of these neighboring countries, certainly with Pakistan and China, and the India's long-standing unsettled border dispute with Bangladesh was only settled recently, and Nepal has started now raking up cartographic issues with India, right? So the violent line of control, of which I have written a lot, that it shares with Pakistan and the Pakistan-sponsored terrorism across the contested border have been major sources of insecurity for the Indian state. The unsettled borders that India has with some of these states and porous borders with many of its neighbors, be it Nepal or Bangladesh, and to some extent with Myanmar, have also led to the issue of illegal migration, which has posed economic and domestic political challenges for India. So what is happening in the, because of the Citizenship Amendment Act, etc., is it is because of the fear of illegal migration, as it were. Right, and finally, if you look at the sources of insecurity for India from the neighborhood, one has to talk about the ganging up of China and Pakistan against India, and this has increased not only New Delhi's sense of insecurity, but it has also damaged its dominant power status in the South Asian region. So India's view of South Asia and how it deals with the South Asian region, therefore, is also dictated by how secure or insecure the Indian state feels vis-a-vis the region. So that is really the third driver of India's South Asian policy. So, if you actually look at it this way, thematically and chronologically, whenever the Indian state has felt secure about its neighborhood, it has been more relaxed in many ways. It has been more forthcoming about some of its sovereignty claims, etc., etc. Whereas whenever India has felt very insecure about the neighborhood, India has been very strict about its sovereignty claim. For example, from 2014 onwards, India has been very insecure about Kashmir, about China, about Pakistan, and that actually shows a tightening of its approach to sovereignty in the region. Now, theoretically speaking, the more you tighten your sovereign claims, the more you become insecure. It's a sort of process, as it were, and sometimes policymakers don't realize that. So we've spoken of three drivers of India's regional policy. One is the colonial legacy, the Raj legacy. The second is India's desire for great power status, and thirdly India's sense of insecurity about the region. And the fourth one is really the rise of China. The future of India's relations with the region will depend on how it will deal with the Chinese engagement of South Asia. Balancing China, balancing Chinese power is not an easy task. How do you how do you develop how do you balance China? Can you economically balance China? Just look at the data. China's GDP in 2019 was 14 trillion US dollars, and its share of global GDP was over 14%. In 2019, India's GDP was 2.8 trillion dollars as opposed to 14 trillion, and the share of global GDP is 2.8% compared to China's 14%. So economically speaking, militarily speaking, it's almost impossible for India to balance China. Soft power wise, even soft power wise, India is finding it very difficult to now beat back the Chinese soft power incursions in the region and globally. My PhD supervisor Rajesh Rajagopal and my colleague at JNU, explains the Sino-Indian military gap in the following words. It's very instructive. Listen to this very carefully. He says, China actually has fewer ground forces than India. China has 1.15 million troops. India has 1.20 million troops. But China enjoys critical terrain advantages along the Sino-Indian border, accentuated by far superior transportation and communication infrastructure in bordering Tibet. Meanwhile, China fields almost twice as many modern combat aircraft as India, 653 to 349, and nearly 3 times as many major surface combat vessels, 79 as opposed to 28, and submarines, 53 as opposed to 14. And China is now building the world's biggest aircraft carrier. China is also building its own 5th generation fighter aircraft, and its aircraft carrier will be larger than any Indian aircraft carrier. Right? What are we talking about? We are talking about a situation where balancing Chinese power is not an option. Is bandwagoning Chinese power an option? That, what bandwagoning means? It's joining the Chinese side, joining BRI and all of that. Is that an option? No, it is not an option either. Is going after China the way the Americans are going after China, is that an option? I don't know. The Americans can sit in the United States of America. We are not sitting there, right? We are sitting right here in the middle of South Asia, next door to China, boxed in by Pakistan and China to some extent. Our ability to balance China is very limited, and probably in the question answer session we can take what we can do, etc. So what is the implication of that for India South Asia policy? That's what we are examining here, right? Until a decade ago, China's focus on South Asia was very limited, which ended up giving a free rein to New Delhi to deal with the region as it pleased. That is not the case anymore. Beijing is making a determined effort to be the dominant player in the South Asian region. China is edging India out. And India simply cannot match. Rupee cannot match the yuan. Right? It's as simple as that. For contemporary China, the days of hiding its capabilities and biding its time of the Deng Xiaoping era is finally over. It's time to become a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence, as President Xi Jinping stated at the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party in 2017. So China's superpower ambitions are bound to have a system-shaping impact in the Asian region. There will be China-led alliances, Chinese client states, and the establishment of Chinese spheres of influence. That is a foregone conclusion. That's a foregone reality. And this and last year's standoff at the Ladakh region, the greater Ladakh region, between the Indian forces and the Chinese forces, has only solidified India's fears, as it were. So the emergence of a China pivot in the region is undeniable. So Washington's role as the South Asian regional system manager is becoming a thing of the past, with Beijing increasingly capable and willing to assume that role and pushing the United States out. Take a look at what's happening in Afghanistan. The Americans are days away from a complete withdrawal of its forces from Afghanistan. Pakistanis are perhaps more triumphant today because their friends, the Taliban, are winning over in Afghanistan. China is back in the game in Afghanistan. The Russians are back in the game in Afghanistan. So you are looking at Taliban, Pakistan, Russia, and China in Afghanistan. Whereas the United States, nowhere. What does that mean for India? Good question to ask. So you're looking at a situation where China is increasingly taking up the role vacated by the power vacuum created by the United States of America. Regional geopolitics from Iran to Central Asia and from South China Sea to the Indian Ocean region is increasingly being shaped by China. China is the new regional hegemon, with states in the region jumping on its bandwagon without much resistance. So there are several. So why is India concerned about that? India is concerned about China's rise in the region for a variety of reasons. Number one, Chinese revisionist claims in the land and oceanic space have been a major source of concern for New Delhi. Right? Beijing's deployment of naval assets to enforce its claims in the South China Sea area, construction of artificial islands in the region, and the rejection of a UN tribunal judgment on a complaint filed by the Philippines, etc., have only strengthened the feeling in Delhi that China is not going to abide by the rules. China has also been increasing its naval presence, including dispatching its nuclear submarines on patrol in the Indian Ocean region. It is in this broader context that China's revisionist statements on Sikkim and Arunachal Pradesh are worryingly viewed in Delhi, and rightly so. So China has a certain history in the recent past of acting on its revisionist claims. Previously, the claims used to be claims. Now they are acting on their claims, and India is therefore worried because the Chinese have been talking about Sikkim and Arunachal Pradesh, etc., etc. Secondly, along with its military assertion, China has also been stepping up its political and economic footprint in the region, dismissing New Delhi's protests, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Sri Lanka, be it in Nepal or Pakistan. Beijing has been involving increasingly in increasing its political footprint in the region, right? And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, what worries New Delhi is the ever-strengthening Sino-Pakistan alliance and its implications for the country. You know, the insecurity that we are facing from China and Pakistan, in some ways, they're coming together in some ways, is a nutcracker situation, right? I mean, it's really like caught between two countries, and we simply have no way out. I mean, I don't want to sort of paint this very scary scenario for you, but look at it this way: you have China, the giant on the line of actual control, heating up as and when it pleases with revisionist claims, willing to act on it. You have the line of control heated up by the Pakistanis. You have an active insurgency in Kashmir. You have territorial claims, or at least cartographic claims made by the Nepalese. You have the Taliban's ascendance in Afghanistan. The Americans are leading from there. The Americans are not really interested in the South Asian region as they used to be. The Chinese are increasing their presence say in the West Asian region. You have their presence in Iran. You have their presence in Gwadar. You have their presence in Sri Lanka. So India is in the middle of this kind of situation. Is that a good situation? Is that, if I were a policy maker, would I want to be in the middle of that kind of situation? I simply wouldn't want to. Right? So Sino-Indian relations, how India is going to deal with China in the region is something that we have yet to determine. I don't think we have a grand strategy yet in place. 2020 was a shocker in many ways. That we never thought China was going to behave in the way they behaved in the Ladakh region. So India is now trying to understand what its options, grand strategic options are. Whatever decisions India would take vis-a-vis China in the region to deal with the Chinese threat in the region, Sino-Indian relations will shape India's regional policy in a significant way in the years to come. There will be pressure on the smaller states of the region to choose between an authoritarian but resourceful China and a democratic but less resourceful India. What they will choose, we don't know. So Sino-Indian relations, or the threat of China, the rise of China, the ascendance of China will also shape India's regional policy, South Asia policy. Let me come to the final driver that I think is going to already shaping India's regional policy. And that is India's half-hearted desire for regionalism. India is a reluctant institution builder in the region. It finds bilateral engagements with the region, with the countries in the region, more useful than multilateral engagements in the South Asian region. So two factors historically have influenced India's pessimistic outlook towards regional organizations. One, the Cold War and the Cold War organizations. For example, the manner in which the regional organizations were set up during the Cold War years by rival bloc, CETO, CENTO, etc., for balance of power purposes. So India was not part of that. India sort of looked at them in a very negative manner. And secondly, New Delhi's initial misgivings about the creation of SAARC by Bangladesh, led by an initiative led by Bangladesh in the 1980s, which New Delhi believed was a ploy to check its influence in the region, right? India was more keen on, during those years, India was more keen, especially during Nehru's years, was keen on a pan-Asian regionalism than a South Asian subcontinental grouping. Clearly, there was no SAARC at that point of time, but India was looking at the big picture, Asian regionalism. As Professor S.D. Muni points out, Nehru seldom thought in terms of building a community with the smaller immediate neighbors. If at all, Nehru thought that such a community would be encompassed within the broader goal of an Asian solidarity. The 1962 war with China and Nehru's death 2 years later somehow undid India's desire for Asian regionalism, etc. So the NAM, therefore, thereafter was a talking shop for the most part. So India has this checkered history about regional institutions, from Cold War institutions to Asian regionalism, and how the Asian regionalism died a premature death after China's attack, etc., etc. So it is in this background that when in the early 1980s Bangladesh proposed the creation of SAARC, New Delhi was skeptical, but it decided to go along with it. And it did not really put its heart and mind to the functioning of SAARC, as it were. So looking back at the SAARC experiment for the last, say, about 38 years or so, it would not be out of place to say that it has been a failed experiment for the most part. irregular summits and political point scoring have been the hallmark of SAARC in many ways. Over the years, New Delhi has also decided to avoid forums that have Pakistan in it, or create new forums without Pakistan in it, right? And India has downplayed the importance of SAARC because Pakistan is a member of that. New Delhi has shifted its focus from SAARC to the BIMSTEC, or South Asia Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation, and the BBIN, none of which, of course, has Pakistan as a member. The one organization where India is actively involved in with Pakistan as a member, of course, is SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because it's a smart thing to do. If India is not a member of the SCO or does not participate in SCO actively, then you will have a forum with China, Pakistan, and Russia, without the United States and India, and the Central Asian states, and that's certainly not a good prospect for India's regional policy, as it were. The fact remains, however, that India's BIMSTEC policy, and the BBIN, etc., haven't been all that proactive, haven't really delivered much, as it were. So India's regional policy has been less than successful, and because of the desire to keep Pakistan out, India has been, downplaying the importance of a otherwise India-dominated SAARC, the institution called SAARC, as it were, in the region. India has to be, in my own personal reflection, has to be more giving towards its neighbors. Now, let me quote what, again, former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran says. He says, to advance regional integration, India should be prepared to offer all its neighbors national treatment, quote unquote, national treatment on its transport network and access to its ports. This means entities from neighboring countries can access our transport infrastructure on the same terms and conditions as our own nationals. The extra load on national infrastructure will be minimal, but the positive political and economic impact on landlocked Nepal and Bhutan would be significant. Let me quote another Indian diplomat, Rajiv Sikri. He says, as the largest country in SAARC, India carries a special responsibility. It must show that it is a true regional leader, not the neighborhood bully. Bold measures on India's part are called for. India, as I said, is a reluctant builder of institutions in the region. Look at China, on the other hand. China is clubbing all these countries together into its own CPEC or its own DRI strategy. Where India is missing out, China is making its presence felt. So India's reluctant reluctant regionalism, reluctant or half-hearted desire for regionalism is another factor that is shaping India's regional policy. I want very quickly, in the next few minutes, I know it's been almost over an hour, also talk about Mr. Modi's regional policy. And I think when I look at the Modi-led government's regional policy, I would make a distinction between Modi 1.0 and Modi 2.0, Modi 1.20 and 2.0. There was more aggression towards the neighborhood in the first tenure of Mr. Modi. Look at India's dealings with Nepal, for example. I mean, India rushed its foreign secretary in December, if I'm not mistaken, 2015, demanding that the Nepalese change their constitution to suit a minority that India thought was left out by the Nepali elite, Kathmandu elite. And when Nepal refused to do that, India imposed an unannounced embargo on Nepal. The remnants, the reverberations of that are still felt in Nepal. If you ask the Nepalese what is making the Nepalese go to the Chinese, they would say your embargo in 2015, 2016. There is this book that recently came out, written by a Nepalese author called Amish Raj Mulmi. The book is called All Roads Lead to North, meaning the Nepalese are moving towards the Chinese. India reportedly interfered in the presidential elections in Sri Lanka to defeat Mahinda Rajapaksa as the president, and then you had a new regime there, and now Mahinda Rajapaksa is back in the game. He's now the prime minister in Sri Lanka. So this kind of interference was more pronounced during Modi 1.0, less pronounced or probably non-existent Modi 2.0. There was more aggression towards the neighborhood in Modi 1.0. I think today there is a lot more engagement of the region. The manner in which, well, I would say both during Modi 1.0 and 2.0, there has been more engagement of the region, more aggressively, not a positive thing, in the first term than in the second term. I also feel that today some of the ideological sort of moorings and predilections of the Bharatiya Janata Party and the Sangh Parivar are perhaps determining India's regional policy to some extent, neighborhood policy to some extent, to Pakistan clearly, perhaps also towards Nepal, to some extent towards Afghanistan. So I would say these are some of the, I mean, Modi's neighborhood policy has been more proactive, but more aggressive, more engaging, but that has also received some pushback. But I think what characterizes Mr. Modi's neighborhood policy is that unlike during the Congress government, right until 2014, today you have a situation of a rising power called China in the region, and India has to deal with that. So most of India's approach to or policies towards the neighborhood is in some ways a reaction to that reality present there. I think I will leave it at that, and we can probably take some questions and answers after I take a deep breath. All right, I think that is an interesting question about Quad. I think the revival of the Quad recently is a function of the threat that India feels from China and the threat that Japan is feeling from China, Australia is feeling from China, and the challenge that the Americans are facing from the Chinese. So there's no question that both the larger geopolitical construct called the Indo-Pacific, from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific, and the Quad are a reaction to the Chinese aggression, the rise of China. Previously, when a Quad had its meetings earlier on in the 2000s, India and even the other powers were quite reluctant about talking about China, naming the Chinese, in fact, addressing the elephant in the room, as it were, because these countries were quite ambivalent about China. Americans were beginning to recognize the threat of China. Japanese had a good trade going on with the Chinese. The Australians were really thick buddies with the Chinese. India did face problems, but India had a close to $95 billion trade with the Chinese. China was India's biggest trading partner in trade in goods. So therefore, there was a certain ambivalence. Today, after China is doing what it is doing in the South China Sea towards Japan and towards Australia, and what it did to India in 2020 in Ladakh, I think there is clarity in the mind of all these countries that China needs to be pushed back. So, Quad, the revival of the Quad, India's invitation to Australia to the Malabar exercise, the increasing talk about Indo-Pacific, all of this needs to be seen as a reaction to that particular reality. Now, what should be India's policy towards the Quad? Will we see the militarization of the Quad? Should there be more militarized? Should there be more military security focus to the Quad? Should it become more institutionalized? Should it become more formalized? Will it become more formalized? I think these are all something that belongs to the realm of future. We don't know. We don't know how it will turn up in the days to come. Now, but if you ask me a subjective opinion, what do I think about it? My own feeling is that India has to be carefully calibrating its strategy towards the Chinese. It has to trade with the Chinese. There's no getting away from that. It has to deal with the Chinese when it can, where it can, in peaceful terms, no question about that. But India has to keep its powder dry, no question about that. India has to find like-minded countries in the region and beyond to stand up to the Chinese bullying, no question about that. So to that extent, if the Indo-Pacific and the Quad would help India, go for it, no question about it. But I think the overt militarization of Quad without proper thinking about it, the implications thereof, may not be a very good idea. Remember, the biggest proponent of the Quad, the United States of America, is an offshore balancer. It sits elsewhere. India has to be here. We have to live here, right, as a country. We have to deal with the Chinese. They're next door. It's a power to reckon with. So I think we need to be careful. We need to carefully calibrate our approach to China. But there's no question that India has to balance China in one way or the other. And if there are willing partners, clearly go with them. I think the most important aspect of any collaboration with others to checkmate China, to check Chinese aggression in the region, is in the field of intelligence sharing and increasing interoperability among the militaries. I don't imagine if there is a shooting war between India and China, the Americans are going to come with their guns and help India out. I don't think that's happening. What will they do at best? They will provide real-time intelligence, troop movements, troop mobilization, etc. That's what India needs. So India might want a lot more intelligence of that kind and even peacetime intelligence from Japan, from Australia, from UK, from the United States. I think if the Quad helps India with that, if the Indo-Pacific helps India with that, good, go for it. The trouble with India's Myanmar policy is that India is looking at a complicated situation there. There was a time when India was a pro-democracy voice in the region as far as Myanmar was concerned. It hosted pro-democracy activists in Delhi and other parts of the country. It was against the junta in Myanmar. That time is perhaps over. Let me sort of explain the complication that we are faced with at this point of time. On the one hand, you have the Rohingya refugees in India who are driven out of the Rakhine state in Myanmar. They are in Delhi, they are in many parts of the country. There are concerns about, rightly or wrongly, I don't know the veracity of that, about some extremist elements in amongst them. So the Rohingya refugee issue is a factor that India has to consider while evolving and developing a policy towards Myanmar, number one. Number two, with the coup in Myanmar, not just Rohingyas, but also other Myanmaris are arriving at India's shores, especially in the northeast of India. And northeast has its own complications, right? It has its own insurgencies, it has its own porous border. So you have a second set of refugees arriving there. If India is too proactively inviting them into its own borders, it will have one domestic political implications. Two, the Myanmarese junta, the Tatmadaw, will not be very happy with that. What is the direct implication of that? One direct implication would be that many of the insurgents fighting in the northeast would then be given asylum, or would then be given refuge, or would then be given assistance by the Myanmarese Tatmadaw, the junta there. So that's a security angle right there. Thirdly, India has investments in Rakhine State and in other parts of Myanmar. If India turns against the military, because the military has staged a coup there, India's investments in Myanmar could be in trouble. Four, if you look at the pre-coup period, it was not as if Aung San Suu Kyi was very favorable to India and she was anti-China. No, she was actually sucking up to the Chinese. It was the Tatmadaw, the military, that stood up against the Chinese. So India has a certain relationship with the Tatmadaw, and it doesn't want to sacrifice that. Perhaps rightly so. The final point, which is if India takes a negative stand towards, an aggressive stand towards the Tatmadaw, and sort of, issue statements through its permanent representative in the Insecurity Council, etc., then the Tatmadaw is going to get closer to the Chinese in Myanmar. So Chinese are waiting for India to make a mistake to help the dispensation, the military dispensation in Myanmar. So that's the background. Within that background, what really are India's options? I think I would say very limited options India has there. One, I think India should join with perhaps some of the others, like Bangladesh, like China. There's no reason why India should not reach out to the Chinese and the Bangladeshis and start talking about perhaps some kind of a political process in Myanmar, some kind of a process of rehabilitating the refugees there. So one is that conversation can continue to happen. Two, India also can reach out to the Tatmadaw in Myanmar and tell them there is a need to sort of stop the violence. India has friends and allies in various factions, in various quarters of the Myanmari society, political groups, etc. So India can probably use some of that goodwill to broker a deal perhaps with the Tatmadaw and the agitating youth and the wider population as it were. India should not completely be silent or not allow some of the refugees coming into India's shores, because tomorrow you don't know whether the junta is going to continue. It depends on the Biden administration. It depends on the extent of the resistance within Myanmar. What if tomorrow there is a democratic government? If the Tatmadaw is defeated, then what happens? Then the entire new dispensation is going to be anti-India. So I think India has to trade carefully and perhaps take a few subtle steps rather than going all out about it purely from a strategic point of view. Obviously, from a humanitarian point of view, may want to do other things, but India has to, I think, when it comes to Myanmar, think about it more strategically. Thank you. I don't know what prompts you to say that on the face of it. I do not consider Pakistan and China breaking up, if that's what you have in mind. I think that's quite a love affair to break up so easily and so quickly. Having said that, let me nuance that a little further. It's interesting to note that during the 2020 standoff between India and China on the line of actual control, Pakistan did not really heat up the border on the line of control. Pakistan actually stayed away. In fact, traditionally, when India and Pakistan had their trouble, the Chinese had stayed away too, in many ways. Pakistan also realizes that the sections in Pakistan realize that the engagement with China, economic engagement with China, strategic engagement with China, could potentially lead Pakistan to a debt trap burden. It could potentially make Pakistan a satellite state of China. There are these fears. But while there are these fears, there is a you know there is a wide belief in Pakistan across political parties and strategic circles in Pakistan that China is necessary for their growth. But there's also counter view that too much of China would be not very good for Pakistan in the longer run. So if these views pick up, perhaps you might see some rethinking within Pakistan. But I think if that view needs to be encouraged, I think the ball is in India's court. If Pakistan cannot trade with India, it will continue to increase its trade with China. If Pakistan cannot buy cotton, medicines, this and the other from India, it will continue to buy that from China. So we need to think, we need to ask ourselves, should we stop all trade with Pakistan? Or because from a strategic point of view, any space that we give will be occupied by the Chinese. But I don't really foresee a Pakistan, India, Russia axis developing, not anytime soon, unless until something really dramatic happens. Our foreign economic policy is often driven, sometimes rightly so, but sometimes not so rightly so, driven by domestic, political, and economic considerations. If RCEP were to fructify with India as a member of it, you would have had a situation where the RCEP member states, including China, would create problems for Indian merchants, farmers, industrialists, etc., etc. That's for sure. Therefore, there was a pushback from domestic communities within India, farmers, traders, etc., to not sign it. I agree with that to some extent. However, what is on? I mean, as an aspirant, you should be able to look at both sides of the argument, right? The trouble with that argument is that when India does not join RCEP, what happens? Who is going to dominate RCEP? China. The entire regional supply chains, Japan to Southeast Asia to China, all these supply chains are now going to be dominated by China. It would have still been dominated by China had India been a part of it. But at least India would have provided some alternatives to some of these members of the RCEP. Now they simply don't have a choice but to accept the Chinese dominance in the supply chains. And the moment, India is already doing pretty bad vis-a-vis regional trade, right? China is doing very well in regional trade. RCEP is only going to increase that gap, increase that benefit that China has over India, advantage that China has over India in the regional trading landscape. So I think, my personal opinion, India has made a mistake. Sometimes when you enter into this kind of free trade area agreements, there will be some pains. There will be some pain in the beginning. India will have to better its systems. India will have to help its industries and farmers to sort of come up to the come up to a level where they can compete with others in the region. But because of that fear, because of that pain, if you avoid all trade with others and go on with the Atmanirbhar Bharat, I don't know where we will get with that. So personally speaking, I think it was a mistake. No, I think we've come a very long way. I don't think Panchsheel is the guiding principle at this point of time. I don't think even Gujarat Doctrine. What is the heart of the Gujarat Doctrine? The heart of the Gujarat Doctrine is non-reciprocity. That India will not seek the same favors for India that it is willing to give to other neighboring countries. Is that really happening? If that were to be happening, India would have resolved the Teesta water, conflict with Bangladesh. If that were to be the case, we would have been on the RCEP. If that were to be the case, we'd have reached out to many of our neighboring countries with more magnanimity. That really hasn't happened. So today, India is a country that believes in reciprocity, not non-reciprocity. India is a country that believes in strong, clear measures. India is a country that asks, what am I going to get out of it? That is not the spirit of the Gujarat Doctrine. So I don't know if that is what is the guiding principle, or even the Panchsheel Agreement. I think we've come a very, very, very long way. It's not entirely bad. I mean, a country has to look after its interests, but the country also has to, as Rajiv Sikri says, as the largest country in the SAARC, India carries a special responsibility. It needs to be more magnanimous, which it is not. And therefore, it is probably not its policy is not reflecting the spirit of either the Panchsheel or the Gujarat Doctrine. If I knew the question, I'm India's national security advisor, right? If I knew the answer to that question. Not that I think the national security advisor has an answer to that either. Let's put it this way. I think that's a very, very complex question and difficult question to answer. What can India do to reinstate its status in the South Asian region, despite the rising Chinese presence? And I made the argument the other day in a conference. I said, India has to go back to some of its civilizational, cultural connect with the region. So somebody pushed back saying that that's the last thing you want to do, because the more you talk about connection, civilization, culture, people are going to say that you're trying to impose things on us. But my response to that is, it's how you do it. Software, the Americans have been past masters at spreading soft power, right? I think India needs to spread its soft power more subtly but more proactively in the region. It's how you do it. Don't impose it. If our diplomats posted to regional capitals continue to behave like the modern viceroys in those capitals, obviously people are going to be unhappy about it. We need to be subtle, humble, and nimble. All of these are not really very Indian qualities, unfortunately. So I think one is that the promotion of subtle, nimble, proactive promotion of soft power, civilizational connect, culture, etc. Two, I think we need to be a little more thoughtful about our refugee policy. Shutting doors to the refugees is not a great policy. Let me tell you. Let me explain it this way. What is the difference between China and India when it comes to South Asia? China is a non-resident power in South Asia. India is not. I mean, look at India and any other country in the region. Cultural, religious, linguistic, ethnic ties. China, very little. So China is a non-resident power in the South Asian region. China does not take any refugees from any South Asian states. Nope. No one goes to China to work or to be a refugee as an immigrant, legal, whatever. What about India? Exact opposite. We should try and make use of that ability that we have to forge connections with these countries. Tell these countries, listen, you come and work here, you have refugees here, you have opportunities here, therefore let us have a certain pact with you guys. The way we have gone about is the wrong way. Why is that? We take refugees and then we call them names. Either you should not take refugees or you don't call them names after you're taking them in. You can't call these guys, these people have come in and then you call them all kinds of names. I think that's not good. What I suggest, therefore, and I wrote about that in the Hindu a few months ago, India has to have a proper refugee policy. My argument is not that we should give citizenship to all people who are knocking on India's doors. Now, that's not possible. That's not good. That's not right. What India should do is that give them work permit. Give them work permit, right? Give them work permit, give them residency, give them all kinds of things, but in a very measured manner, in a calibrated manner, in a systematic manner. It's not as if you come to the border, bribe the ITBP or bribe the BSF, local police, you come inside, you get an Aadhaar card tomorrow. That won't work. We need to clean up our act. We need to put in systems in place. So a lot of countries around the world have received refugees, be it United States of America, Canada, Germany. They have received refugees, but there's a system of doing it. So we have these connections with these people, refugees, ethnic linkages, that is. We need to make use of them in a more systematic, structural manner. If you have a lot of Nepalese working in India, why not give them work permit? If you have a lot of Bangladeshis working, why not give them work permit? So let them come work here, which means our stakes in those countries and their stakes in us, they increase. And the more stakes we have in each other, the easier it is going to be for India to forge a sustained relationship with these countries. It's a long-term game. You can't do that tomorrow. You can't do that with a flying visit. No, it doesn't happen that way. You need to have that sustained policy. Now, that takes me to my bigger point, which is, do we think strategically at all? Do we think strategically? Do we have a national security policy? Do we have a regional policy? Do we have a proper neighborhood, well thought out neighborhood policy? Do our bureaucrats, and many of you are going to become bureaucrats, I hope all of you become bureaucrats, do our bureaucrats and politicians have the incentive to sit back and develop a national security policy? India is a country that has never put out a proper cohesive national security policy. So I think there's a lot more thinking that needs to go into making our national security policy, making our grand strategic approach to our own place in the neighborhood, in South Asia, etc. Reacting to things, calling people names, knee-jerk reactions, that's not national security policy. That's not strategic thinking. Thank you. I'm in the minority when it comes to Pakistan. I'm in the minority because I have always and consistently, and I would assume rationally, made the argument that notwithstanding what Pakistan has done to us, we should resolve our conflicts with Pakistan and move the hell on. Why? Because Pakistan is an irritant. The real strategic threat is China. The more we get bogged down with this, fight with the Pakistanis, the more we are letting the Chinese grow in the region, and the more we are letting the Chinese box us into a never-ending conflict with the Pakistanis. You may turn around and say, Yeah, but the Pakistanis have been murdering Indians, they've been sponsoring terrorism, they've been doing that, they're after Kashmir. I don't disagree. They've been doing all of this. But look at it this way. What did India do to the Pakistanis in 1971? We cut that country into two parts and made two countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh. If Pakistanis were to do that to us, would we have sat quiet about it? No, we wouldn't have. So I think a little bit of realism and a sense of history is very important in understanding this. We only remember 1971 war as an example of triumph. We don't remember that as an example of what it may have done to the psyche of the Pakistani military. Even today, Pakistani generals, and I have quite a few friends in the Pakistani military, retired ones, of course. They tell me even today, in their military colleges, they are taught the humiliation of 71, how India is the perpetual enemy, and how India broke Pakistan into two pieces. The point that I'm trying to make is that we need to come out of this emotionality. We need to look at Pakistan through a realist prism. And the realist prism would tell you that make peace with this country, resolve your differences with this country. And no, I mean, all at the end of the day, what a lot of people say that Pakistan wants Kashmir. That's not true. General Pervez Musharraf engaged in a back-channel conversation with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. For 3 years, their representatives met, and they came out with a formula. And the formula was basically that no change in borders. Borders will be made irrelevant in Jammu and Kashmir. So I think General Bajwa, who's been talking about geoeconomics from geopolitics to geoeconomics, is someone I firmly believe has been signaling to India that we need peace with India. I think India needs to make use of that opportunity, reach out to Pakistan, open trade with Pakistan, sign a ceasefire agreement with Pakistan. At the moment, it's only a phone conversation. Let the Kashmiris trade with each other. Let people go back and forth. At the same time, if there is a terror attack from Pakistan, retaliate in kind. But that doesn't mean that you should not do anything. Then for 10 years, there are no talks with Pakistan. As Shankar Menon said, Katti is not a policy, right? That's an emotional reaction. That's not a policy. So I think that is the way to go. If you want to check China in Afghanistan, if you want to check China in Pakistan, if you want to check China in the region, start with Pakistan. That's the starting point. India also wants access to Afghanistan. Where do you get access to Afghanistan from? I mean, going via Iran, it's going to take time. You're going to get in there. It's not easy. So we need to get into Central Asia. We need to get into Afghanistan. Pakistan is the route. So from whichever way you look at it, it makes absolute and perfect sense for India to make peace with Pakistan. India needs the Americans, especially with the Chinese belligerents. India needs the Americans for intelligence. India needs the Americans for weapon systems. India needs the Americans for technology, trade, all kinds of things. No question about it. But that should not be at the cost of alienating the Russians. I mean, even today, 75% of India's military equipment come from the Russian Federation. The more you, or say, the less you engage the Russians, the stronger the Sino-Russian relationship would become. The stronger the Sino-Russian-Pakistani relationship would become. So therefore, it is important that we continue to engage the Russians at a high level. All kinds of diplomatic, military, political contact needs to be maintained. It is not either or. It is both. India cannot afford not to have this friendship with the Americans. We need this and more. But we cannot afford to alienate the Russians. Russia is a key sort of country in India's regional strategy. The Americans are far away. The Russians are closer. Russians would also provide a certain bulwark against the Chinese from time to time. Let's look at it this way. If there is a if the Chinese are getting more and more belligerent, the Americans can help you in defending against that, perhaps militarily and intelligence wise, etc. But a backdoor diplomacy can be orchestrated by the Russians to get us out of the soup. And the Russians actually did do things even when the India-China standoff was going on the line of action control. So I think alienating the Russians is a very bad idea. We need both, not either or. I was one of those guys who were against India's vaccine diplomacy, and I said, and I continue to stand by what I said. I said we have a, call it vaccine nationalism, call it whatever you want, but we have a responsibility towards our citizens first, and then our neighbors. So before vaccinating our people, it is not a good idea for India to send vaccines to the neighboring countries. India should have. I think where India made a mistake was India woke up to the second wave of the COVID-19 very late. India did not place orders for vaccines until January this year. India did not prepare itself to face a second wave of the COVID-19. And as a result of that, the vaccine production in India also suffered. It should not have been the case. India should have foresaw this. India should have made enough vaccines for itself and its neighbors. But that did not happen. So China is simply making use of that vacuum there. But can India now afford to give vaccines to its neighboring countries when it hasn't been able to provide vaccines to its own citizens? I don't think so. What is the way out? The way out is perhaps, let me put it this way. What Prime Minister Modi started last year, the whole medical regionalism, COVID meetings under the aegis of SARC, I think that was a good beginning. But it died a quick death. I mean, we haven't seen much of that. I think India should invest in more medical regionalism. India is, in many ways, the vaccine factory of the world, the country that produces most number of medicines. So India should be able to provide medical help, vaccines, medicines, that, this, and the other, to its neighbors. So let us create a certain arrangement in the South Asian region under SARC or otherwise, wherein we are able to help these countries from a medical point of view. Now that we have lost our face in the South Asian region, thanks to the withdrawal of the vaccine diplomacy, and quite badly so, we need to pick up the threads. And the way to pick up the threads is really to be more benevolent in that very field, which is the medical field. China is unlikely to do that. India can do that. I think that's what we should put our focus on. I assume you're asking whether India's attempts at altering regimes in these countries is a good idea or not. Big countries intervene in smaller neighboring countries. That is the nature of the international system. But don't get caught. That is smart policy, right? Do you try and do things in your neighborhood, attempting to change regime? Well, that's the extreme, of course. Or trying to do certain things, navigate certain things, trying to put in motion certain process, which will become more politically good for you. Countries do that. But how should they do it? It's not what you do sometimes, but what you should do should be subtle, but it should not be regime change. I think that's really the extreme level. But you said, and sometimes you try and influence things. But how do you go about doing that? Do you go about doing that in a very chest-beating manner? We are a big country, and therefore we'll do what we please. That's not going to work. It will be more subtle, more careful, more nimble, That's the way to go about doing it. Now, I am not saying that, one, that it doesn't happen. Two, that it absolutely should not happen. Ideally, it should not happen. But sometimes you have to put in motion certain political processes. Subtle, one step at a time, and don't be so overt about it. But that's what diplomacy is all about. That if they can't be so subtle about it, what are our agencies getting paid for? They've got to be subtle about it. I know it's a complicated answer I'm giving. Regime change is the extreme step. Preferably, India should not get into that. No one should get into that. But can we completely stay away from all political processes? I don't know if we can do that. All countries do that. All big countries do that in their neighborhood. If it were to be an ideal condition, ideal situation, we wouldn't have. Not everything is an ideal situation, right? Say, for example, today, if tomorrow India speaks about the need for democracy in Myanmar, is that not interfering in the domestic affairs of Myanmar? Technically, it is. But if India does that, is anybody going to blame India for interfering there except the junta there? Not really. So I think it's a complicated question, and here is my complicated answer. It's how you go about doing it. It's what you do, and ideal circumstances versus not so ideal circumstances. I think you could weigh these. The statecraft is unfortunately not a simple trade. Statecraft is it's a complex trade, and if you ever get into the civil services, you realize that, right? I've now been part of the government, but I'm a student of statecraft and national security, etc. And I think it is complex and complicated. I'd like to believe that my country is well equipped to fight against a Chinese threat. But the Chinese cyber and space capabilities, technological capabilities, are far superior to Indian capabilities. So if there is an all-out fight with the Chinese tomorrow, all-out is unlikely to happen because of nuclear deterrence. But if there is a conventional war of a certain kind, like the one in 1962, I am not very optimistic about our ability to push back the Chinese very effectively. The Chinese power is far superior to our power. Now let's try and look at the two-front situation. It's also how you define the two-front situation. Does it mean two fronts actively fighting against you at the same time? Or is one front going to collaborate with the other, collude with the other? There are different ways of looking at it. But let's say we are talking about two fronts colluding with each other to fight against India at the same time. I think it's going to be very, 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 very difficult for India to stand its ground if Pakistan and China declare war against India at the same time. That's unlikely to happen. I think so. I think a all-out two-front war is something. Let's say a nuclear war between India and China, unlikely to happen. A nuclear war between India and Pakistan, unlikely to happen. An all-out war between India and Pakistan or India and China, unlikely to happen. We are probably talking about a medium conventional level or a low conventional level conflict between India and China, or India and Pakistan. If that happens, India would find itself in serious trouble. It's not easy to put up with these two adversaries at the same time. Remember, the Chinese and Pakistanis also share technology, intelligence, surveillance, all kinds of things. They have a lot of data, real-time data sharing. That would make India's fight against these two countries very tough. So I hope we are prepared adequately for a one-front war. Even there, I think we would face real huge difficulties because of the Chinese dominance over India and in the technology sector, space, hypersonic weapons, cyber weapons. I mean, there was this New York Times story. I don't know if you guys saw that. about how the Chinese hacked into our power systems in Mumbai and shut down Mumbai for a few hours. The Chinese can do to Mumbai city. Imagine what they could do to a lot of other Indian facilities. Uh, and I don't know if India is capable of, doing the same favor back to China. So yeah, that's my answer. And I have to say, I'm very, very impressed by the standard of questions. Very, very thoughtful, insightful questions. And I really wish you guys all the best. I hope you really make it to the civil services, and I hope you do India some good. We need thoughtful leaders. We need thoughtful bureaucrats. We need thoughtful diplomats. And I hope we do well as a country in our foreign policy. I want our country to be a great power one day. So thank you all so much for listening to me. You have a nice evening.